In Warzone, knowing how to position yourself correctly is crucial to both winning gunfights and to winning games. Good positioning means that you'll be able to create an advantage for yourself in just about any situation. The problem though, is that it's an incredibly complicated and difficult skill to master. If you don't know what you're doing, you can easily make mistakes that will, at the very least, make your life much harder, and, at the very worst, they can cost you the game. In this battle royale, there's simply no such thing as a list of strong positions that are going to be good in every single game. The spread of enemies, the location of the safe zone, and so much more can completely transform which areas are considered powerful and which areas are considered weak on a game-by-game basis. That's why you need to know how to identify which positions are considered strong in every match of Warzone that you're in. You need to know how to adapt to the different demands of each game, and that's what this video is all about. I'll be giving you the ultimate guide to positioning, showing you the key factors and principles that you can use in every single one of your matches to identify the strongest position available and how you can use it to create an advantage for yourself. I'm focusing specifically on Warzone Solos for this video, because the total lack of teammates means that positioning is possibly at its most important in this mode. As there are so many different aspects to positioning, I've put timestamps in the description if you want to skip ahead to a specific part of this guide. I'll be starting off by examining the basics of how to identify a strong spot. Then, I'll move on to more specific tips and tricks that are more advanced. Feel free to adapt this guidance to suit your needs and playstyle, as you'll always perform at your best when you play to your own individual strengths. First off, what makes a good position? This is a very broad question, and it can have a very broad answer, but there are some recurring themes that can guide you when you're trying to decide what's best. For instance, high ground is usually considered to be a crucial factor in determining a good location to be in. If you're higher than your opponent, this has a whole host of advantages. You'll be a much more difficult target for them to hit, as the elevation you're at will provide you with cover. In turn, enemies will be much easier to take on, as you can essentially shoot over a great deal of the surrounding area, rendering most of their protection useless. Plus, you'll have a much better view of what's around you. This makes spotting and dealing with threats much easier. For these reasons, you can usually assume that rooftops, tall buildings and upper floor rooms are good places to be. But what gets overlooked a lot is that high ground doesn't necessarily have to just apply to buildings. If you can situate yourself on a hilltop, cliff, or even on top of a vehicle, this can also be considered high ground. It's all relative to the situation that you're in. You see, what matters really is that, so long as you're above your enemy in terms of gradient, you have the advantage. Don't fall into the trap of thinking that, because you're not up high on a building, you don't have cover. This clip here demonstrates how easily you can move to a higher position. By mantling up onto this truck, I've made myself much harder to see and much harder to damage. As such, I can take down this enemy without a problem. Whilst I wasn't high up compared to a building or rooftop, you need to remember that it's all relevant to your current situation. As this clip shows, you can always create your own high ground by running up a hill or mantling up a surface. But, just because a position is up high, doesn't necessarily mean that it's a good spot to be in. You need to evaluate the cover in that area in order to decide whether or not you should be there. For instance, a lot of rooftops have barriers around the edge, walkways on top, or other features that act as physical cover. On hills and more rural locations, trees and rocks can serve the same purpose. That purpose is to protect you from gunfire. When you start engaging a player, they will probably shoot back, so you need a way of protecting yourself. If you're surprised by an enemy as well, then it's crucial that you have something to hand that offers you effective protection. Remember that cover is necessary to protect you both when you're attacking an enemy, but also when you're being attacked yourself. This is why a balance of cover and high ground is so important. There's no point being in an incredibly high area if there's no cover there, as ultimately this leaves you incredibly exposed and vulnerable. It's always worth remembering that there are some incredibly accurate players out there who will punish you if you don't have cover to hand. One of the most common mistakes I see in Warzone is a player getting themselves trapped in an exposed position because, whilst they may be up high, they've got no way to protect themselves once they're actually targeted. Think about what you're going to do if an enemy player, like a sniper, gets sight of you. What can you use to protect yourself? Don't let yourself get caught out. Take the time to examine what's available to protect you. The last thing you want is to get into a gunfight and realise that you're an easy target. So now you know the basic underlying principles of picking a good position. But thanks to the great variety of Warzone, there's a lot more that you need to know. A huge part of this variety comes with the position of both enemies and the position of the gas. Now in solos, you tend to find that players are much more defensive, but also that there's a greater spread of players thanks to the increased number of teams. This means that you can expect players to be incredibly cautious. They will be trying to stay out of sight, moving slowly and quietly so they're not given away by audio. You need to bear this in mind when picking a good position. Make sure you know how it can be accessed by other players. Take the time to consider the route that a pushing enemy may take when challenging you. As the audio is so unreliable in this game, it's important to constantly keep a lookout for any nearby enemies. This can be heavily influenced by the gas and the safe zone. As the gas field contracts, players will run from it as they make their various rotations to wherever they're going. If you want an advantage over these players, then you need to account for how the gas may affect their movement. If you're in the next safe zone, you should be prepared for enemies to rotate into your area. What positions might they move to? What areas are they coming from? All of this will give you a clear area to survey and watch. This will both protect you and make picking up kills easier. On the flip side, if you're coming into the next zone, think about where enemies are likely to be. Again, as players are so defensive in this mode, you can bet that they will try their hardest to be in the strongest position possible. Sometimes though, positioning won't come down to getting yourself to a typically good spot, but about how you're able to use what's around you to your advantage. This is especially important when you're both fighting at close quarters, as well as when you're later in the game and there's less cover around. This is when a good understanding of how you can manipulate perspective to your advantage is important. There will be occasions when you're caught out in the open, with very little cover or high ground available. You may well come face to face with an enemy, and you're going to have no choice but to stand and fight. The best thing to do in this case is to limit your enemy's ability to see you, and therefore hit you, as well as make your movements unpredictable. Say you're battling around a pillar, then placing that pillar between you is a very powerful, yet simple thing to do. By placing a physical object between you and your enemy, you break their line of sight. Then, if you're pushing them, you're applying a huge amount of pressure. If you're fighting from more distance, then simply ducking and peeking from cover at different points and angles can be a great strategy. In these situations, don't worry so much about whether you're covered from all angles. As teams are only made up of one player, you only have one direction of gunfire to immediately worry about. It doesn't matter if your back is exposed, as the biggest threat to you at that point in time is whichever player you're currently fighting. This is exactly why manipulating the enemy's visibility is so important. All they need to do is briefly lose track of you for a second or two, and you've got yourself the advantage. It'll give you enough time to move to a different piece of cover or dish out significant damage. That can really make the difference between winning and losing a gunfight. It's important that you don't panic, but intelligently deal with whatever situation you're in. The worst thing you can do is just assume you're dead because you're out of what's typically considered good cover. One thing that I haven't covered yet is how the weapons you're carrying should influence your choice of positioning. Being on the tallest building for miles around is great in principle, but if you don't have a long-range weapon to hand, then it's not going to make your life any better. If you're carrying an SMG or shotgun as your primary weapon, then you're much better off sticking to smaller, more confined spaces where these weapons can shine. Obviously, if you have a loadout, it's very easy to plan the kind of area that you want to occupy. If you know you're going to be selecting a long-range HDR setup, then heading to a rooftop is probably a great idea. But if you either can't get to your own custom weapons, or you're still trying to gather the cash needed for a loadout, then you need to play around the weapons that you currently have. In solos, the only weapons that you can engage enemies with are those that you're carrying. Don't put yourself in a situation where those weapons aren't effective. This is something that you should really bear in mind before the match even begins. If you want to use a sniper loadout, then land in an area that you're comfortable using a sniper in, and use positioning that reflects that. The same logic can be applied to any weapon and any loadout. Simply put, place yourself in an environment, when possible, that your weapons are ideally suited to. This point about weapons is relatively small, but it links very closely with a much broader, arguably much more important point of planning. You always want to be thinking one step ahead, figuring out where you want to be before you get there. Look at the next safe zone. Think about where you want to be based on that. If you're not currently in a good position, then how are you going to get to a good one? As I've mentioned before in this guide, just reacting to what's going on in Warzone isn't going to be good enough. The same applies to positioning. If you're always thinking ahead about where you want to be and how you're going to get there, you're going to have a huge advantage compared to those who aren't thinking like you. Planning ahead will reduce the amount of time that you spend out in the open or exposed to enemy players. This planning process also applies once you've reached whatever position you've decided to take. Think about what you're going to do if you're forced out of that spot, say by a pushing player or kill streak. What's the backup plan? If you can get into the habit of thinking like this, it'll be far harder for enemies to catch you out. You can instantly reduce and counter just about any advantage an enemy gets over you by simply knowing what your next move is before you make it. Obviously, you cannot know what each next ring entails and how that will affect the game. But then again, neither does anyone else. As soon as you have the information available, you want to get planning your next move and the best position for you. One of the last things that I want to cover in this video is that a good position doesn't make you invincible. In solos, you're always just one sniper headshot away from game over. Just because you're in a good spot, on high ground, with plenty of cover around, doesn't mean that you're always going to come out of a gunfight on top. You can be forced to move by kill streaks like airstrikes and cluster strikes. You could take gunfire from multiple enemy players who are spread out around you. Or you may just get dropped by a sniper that you never saw. Don't get too comfortable in an area, as you never know when you're going to be forced to leave it. The last thing you want to do is let your guard down, as you can be sure that there's an enemy somewhere who will use that against you. Stay aware. Keep moving so that you're not an easy target. Make sure you're checking your weak spots and that there aren't enemies sneaking up on you. The time to kill in this game is brutally fast, so any player can be the death of you if you're not careful. Knowing when and where to position yourself in Warzone is an incredibly complicated and difficult thing to do. There's simply so many factors that are totally out of your control that there's often no such thing as the perfect solution. The best you can do is evaluate the situation that you find yourself in and make a calculated judgment call on what you think is the best thing to do. Sometimes you will make the wrong decision. That's just how it goes. But by using this guide, you can improve and refine the skill of figuring out the best position to take. Like I said at the start of this video, there is absolutely no point me giving you a list of strong positions to be in. In one game, a certain building might be incredibly powerful, but in another, it might be rendered totally useless due to the position of enemies or any other number of factors. That's why you need to know how to recognise that the power of a position changes with each game. Learning how to do this effectively is what will truly make you a better player. Hopefully, this guide has shown you how to identify the best position in just about any given situation. You can adapt and meet the demands of each unique game of solos, continuously giving yourself the advantage in every situation possible.